president is none other than the Reverend Dr. Jesse Lewis Jackson. We have a great broadcast for you today, TV land. We have Brian Stevenson. We have Jonathan Jackson. We have LMW Choir. We have Reverend Jeanette, and most of all, we have you. Are you on board? Tweet somebody, text somebody, because the push is on, the push is on, the push is on.
Oh, we shall overcome someday. Yeah, deep in my heart. Oh, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. Come on, put those hands. Yeah, we shall. Somebody singing, we shall. Let it ring out that we shall overcome someday. Yes, deep in my heart, oh, I believe that we shall overcome someday.
Yes, 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 we shall overcome someday. We're so excited to be at our Saturday morning forum. So much information and so much knowledge that you can gain by tuning in with us this morning. We're live streaming across this land and country and internationally. And we're so thankful for you tuning in with us this morning. We have prayers and condolences for the family of our former National Field Director and member Mark Allen, whose father made his transition, J. Minor Allen. His homegoing services are as follows. The visitation will be held on Friday, June 22nd, from the hours of 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. at the Southwest Memorial Chapel, located at 79th and Comiskey in Chicago, Illinois. The funeral services will be held on Saturday, June the 23rd, 2008, at St. James Ministry Church of God in Christ at 117th and South Low Avenue. We're also asking for prayers of Chicago Alderman Susan Sadlowski Garces, whose father made his transition. Chicago Steelworkers activist Ed Sadlowski passed last week. We continue to pray and we continue to support the young people and the Parkland students on their Peace March that was recently in Chicago and that will occur this summer throughout the nation. We're asking that you continue to pray and lift up our students from Chicago public schools and charter schools as we begin to enter the summer months, because we know that violence is trying to plague our community. But we know that if we pray, and if we work together, we can save the lives of our young people. Can I get an amen? We know that if we do that, we can really save our young people. This week will be the beginning of Juneteenth. We need to know the history and the plight of our people. And as I would say all the time, we need to show somebody, inform somebody, and let them know that our lives do matter. We're so proud of the work that we're doing with our Push Excel, and we're getting ready to introduce our next young speaker, who's going to give us an oratorical after the singing of this great choir. Do you remember this choir from last week? They made our hearts burn, and we are so excited that they are back with us. We love them. Come on, somebody, don't we love them? Give a hand of applause to the LXW choir. Amen.
Rainbow Push, I need y'all's help this morning. Is that all right? Can I get a little help this morning? I know it's a little early in the morning, but I need everybody to get up and just dance with us one time. Is that all right? Is that all right? Hit me with it, band. Come on. Come on. All right, now I need y'all with me. I need you with me. Y'all gonna make some noise out there? 1, 2, get it. Everybody, let move. Y'all not moving with me. All right, that's what I need. I told y'all it's not gonna work if y'all not moving now. I know it's early in the morning, but we're gonna try this one more again. It's okay. Nudge your neighbor and say, I need you moving, I need you moving. Tell us I need you moving. Hit me with it, band, one more time. I think they got it right now. I think we're ready for it. 1 and 2, let's get it. Hey! Come on, y'all. Let's try this together. When I think about you, say, when like I heard. Yeah, what the Lord has done. Hey, so let me help you understand. The victory is won. Yo, 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 break it down, break it down, break it down. Say Alex Dub. Do you love the Lord? The enemy defeated. Now do you really mean it? Yo, this is a freedom song. So sing along. Get up on your feet. And let's move and dance for the victory. All right, y'all gotta move with us. Hey, for the victory. Yeah, I said dance for the victory. Hey, for the victory. Real quick, break it down like this. I need a little bit of help in here real quick. Y'all got some help in here? Y'all got it now? Y'all got it now? Y'all look like y'all got it now. I'm gonna ask you a question. I'm gonna say it like this. I'm gonna say, why you praise the Lord like that? And you just say, been so good, I can't turn back. Y'all got it? All right? I say, why y'all praise the Lord like that? Been too good, can't hold back. Why y'all praise the Lord like that? Little louder, why y'all praise the Lord like that? Why y'all praise the Lord like that? Okay, I think y'all got it now. I think y'all got it. So I got a question. Band, bring it up one time like this. Yo, I say, ladies, where y'all at tonight? I say, ladies, where y'all at, huh? Yo, ladies, make some noise in here. I say, ladies, make some noise. Say it like this. Why y'all praise the Lord like that? Okay, why y'all praise the Lord like that? What's wrong with y'all praising God like that? I say, why y'all praise the Lord like that? Hey, now, dance for your victory. Just dance for your victory. I know it's early. We get a little cardio in. Hey, I got a question for you, yo. Now, where all my men at real quick? All the men make some noise out there. I said, all the freedom fighter men make some noise out there. Hey. Yo. I say, fellas, where y'all at, huh? I say, fellas, where y'all at today? Yo, fellas, where y'all at, huh? Come on louder, fellas, where y'all at, huh? I said, why y'all praise the Lord like that? Why y'all praise the Lord like that? What's wrong with y'all praising God like that? Well, praise the Lord like you know how to act. Hey, come on, now dance for your victory. Can you dance for your victory? Yeah, dance for your victory. For the victory. Yo. Y'all said, my people, where y'all at today? A little louder. Where y'all at? I know it's early. Where you at, huh? Where you at today? Make some noise. All my people praise the Lord like that. I say, why y'all praise the Lord like that? All people say, why y'all praise the Lord like that? Praise the Lord like you know how to act. Hey, make some noise. Dance for the victory. Dance for the victory. Hey, just dance for the victory. Now everybody clap your hands. Everybody clap your hands. One more time, yo. I say, people, where y'all at, huh? Little louder, please. Where y'all at today? All my people, where y'all at, huh? My people, where y'all at, huh? One more time, say, why y'all praise the Lord like that? Why y'all praise the Lord like that? What's wrong with y'all praising God like that? This the freedom song. Know how to act. Hey, let's get it. Dance for the victory. Hey, for the victory. Yeah, dance for your victory. For the victory. I'm gonna do like this. Yo, man, give me one right there. Man, give me one right there. Give me one right there. Give me one right there. Man, give me two right there. Give me two
Come on, let's give it up for LXW. We have so many special guests with us this morning. We have the mayor of Flint, Michigan. Would you wave your hand, Mayor Weaver, Tougaloo alumnus. We have our international delegation from South Africa. If you're here, raise your hand. Give them some love. We have Mark Thompson from Sirius XM with us from New York City. And then we have our special guest, our honoree and our keynote speaker, Brian Stevenson. Let's show him some love. This young lady has stolen our hearts here at Rainbow Push, and she loves to do what she does. Let's show a warm welcome for our speaker and our orator, young Carly Lewis. Let's show her some love.
Good morning. Today I will recite for you excerpts from television by Roald Dahl. The most important thing we've learned so far as children are concerned is never, never, never let them near the television set. Or better yet, just don't install the idiotic thing at all. At almost every house we've been, we've watched them gaping at the screen. They loll and slop and lounge about and stare until their eyes pop out. They sit and stare and stare and sit until they're hypnotized by it, until they're absolutely drunk with all that shocking, ghastly junk. Oh yes, we know it keeps them still. They don't climb out the windowsill. They never fight or kick or punch. They leave you free to cook the lunch, to wash the dishes in the sink. But did you ever stop and think and wonder just exactly what this does to your beloved tot? It rots the senses in the head. It kills the imagination dead. It clogs and clutters up the mind. It makes a child so dull, so blind. He can no longer understand a fantasy, a fairyland. His brain becomes as soft as cheese. His powers of thinking rust and freeze. He can no longer think, he only sees. All right, you'll cry. All right, you'll say. But if we take the set away, what shall we do to entertain our darling children? Please explain. We'll answer this by asking you, what did the darling ones used to do? How did they used to keep themselves contented before this monster was invented? Have you forgotten? Don't you know? We'll say it very loud and slow. They used to read. They'd read and read and read and read, and then proceed to read some more. Great Scots, gadzooks, one half their life was reading books. The nursery shelves held books galore. Books cluttered up the nursery floor. And in the bedroom by the bed, more books were waiting to be read. Oh, books, what books they used to know, those children living long ago. So please, oh please, we beg, we pray, go throw your TV set away. And in its place, you can install a lovely bookshelf on the wall. Then fill the shelves with locks of books, ignoring all the dirty looks, the screams, the yells, the bites, the kicks, and children hitting you with sticks. Fear not, because we promise you that in about a week or two of having nothing else to do, they'll begin to feel the need of having something to read. And once they start, oh boy, you'll watch the slowly growing joy that fills their hearts. They'll grow so keen, they'll wonder what they'd ever seen in that ridiculous machine, that nauseating, foul, unclean, repulsive television screen. And later, each and every kid will love you more for what you did. Thank you. And now, join me as I introduce the Reverend Jesse L. Jackson Sr.
neglect me. I am somebody. My mind is a pearl. I can learn anything in the world. If my mind can conceive it and my heart can believe it, I know I can achieve it. I am God's child. Stop the violence, save the children. Stop the violence, save the children. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Right. Put your hands together, put your hands together. The mayor of Flint, Michigan, Mayor Karen Weaver, give it up. From Tougaloo, give it up. The wife of Brother Kurt Flood, Judy Page, stand Judy, give Judy a big hand. From Stay Woke, Mark Thompson, give it up for Mark Thompson. From Detroit, Brother John Graves, give it up. Outstanding Carly Lewis. No notes, just talking that to give her a big hand. We've had a challenging week of work. All agenda items lead to November the 6th. But 50 years ago, when under oppression, we could hope for change. Now we can vote for it. Nobody has earned the right to do less than their best. We do our best, victory is assured. When blacks are set free, white women are set free. Latinos are set free. And labor are set free. We're not the bottom, we're the foundation. The bottom is where you end up. The foundation is where you start from. Say, we are the foundation. We're the foundation of America's economy. We made cotton cane. We made tobacco roll. We're the foundation of American economy. Slave trade, more wealthy than banks, insurance companies, our land, our labor, and resources from Africa. We made America great. We are the foundation. Now we demand repair for damage done. Put your hands up, put your hands together, put your hands together. Sister Karen, we did something this week that's kind of interesting. One, on Wednesday we kicked off with the help of Brother Omar Sharif, bringing together black and white and Latino contractors and workers. We've trained about 400 flaggers this year. Those women who do the flags, go slow and all that, those are about $75 an hour jobs. Those are well-paying jobs. But beyond that, in most cities today, we're given the city we cannot build the city where we live in. We'll have to recruit people from outside to build where we live. We cannot hammer and nail. We're not iron workers. We're not steel workers. We have the right to have, we must now fight not charter schools or public schools, but training schools. We must be able to build, where we live, our houses, our highways, our churches, our businesses. We must develop the skill set. And that was pretty much about Wednesday. that night with the help of Santita Jackson and Darius Brooks and D'Andra Patterson and Audrey Du Bois Harris, a tremendous expression of our arts and talents at the Apostolic Faith Church, Bishop Horace Smith. A big hand for Bishop Horace Smith. On Thursday morning was our business segment, dealing with the fact that reason to say, you know, we used to have land in the South and we left it. No, we were driven out of that land. See, if I have land and can't get seeds, if I have land and can't go to the market, if I have land and can't get capital, the land has no value. So we didn't leave because something was wrong with us, something was wrong with the system. We'll talk more about kind of what that means. And then at noontime, the minister's luncheon, Brother Todd Year did a tremendous job. There are 4 million blacks in the South today, 4 million unregistered vote, 4 million, or 2.5 million who registered last time who did not vote. Another 2 million votes, according to Bob Brown Wine, was taken from us, votes. So we have the power to determine the course of our country come November. Hands that once picked cotton can now pick presidents. Put your hand together. Thursday night, Reverend Barber gave a tremendous message at the Labor Day dinner on Thursday night, as 55% of all African Americans make less than $15 an hour. Half of them make less than $10 an hour. It's a substantial number, make around $7 an hour. We're basically working poor people. And there are others who make more than 15 say, but if I make more than $15 an hour and spend more than I make and vote less than I have, that's suicide. See, if I spend more than I make and vote less than I have, then I'm a debt slave. Involuntary slavery is legal. Voluntary slavery cannot be stopped. Can I get a witness here? Brother Dan Davis held down the fort on health care on Friday morning, and Danny Glover spoke along with Isla from South Africa. We have 200 South Africans here, Southern Africa, South Africa, and the Zambia and Zimbabwe. We have with us the college president, Dr. Hogan from Tougaloo, president from Kentucky State. We're going to send several hundred African American students to Southern Africa a year for study and then bring them here. We're beginning international exchange. Many Africans have land and don't know scientific farming. Many of our kids learn scientific farming at Texas A&M, at Tennessee State and Southern, but don't have land. Y'all watch this now. Watch this real careful. If you have, when Booker Washington went south, he said the thing that caught his attention was he saw people sitting in the middle of fields starving because they could grow a garden. They didn't know how to scientific farming. So we're going to get the students, the HBCUs that teach agriculture and let them study in Africa for a year, bring African students here to learn business for a year. And they will be a generation that will grow up with a sense of Africanness. Noontime, what a luncheon yesterday. Stacey Abrams, the next governor of Georgia. Put your hand together. Say, Stacey Abrams, next governor of Georgia. There are two things that stand between her and being the next governor. There's 600,000 blacks in Georgia unregistered. So if we vote our numbers and invest in our campaign, we can win Georgia. If we win Georgia, we can win Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana. The ex-slave states will still hold the key to our liberation, John Graves. The ex-slave states have the ratio numbers to change it. And Brother Brian might tell you why we're no longer in the South. We didn't just happen to leave as immigrants. We left for, I'm not going to take all of his stuff. I used all of it. Said Jesse Jackson, use Brian Stevens stuff all the time. They think I'm smart, but I really ain't. It's really Brian Stevens. Today, we're altering our program a bit. Brian is our special guest. All week long, we've had as our special guest artist the very able and talented Audrey DuBois Harris. And she's with us again today. Do let me say to you that I want to express my thanks to Jonathan Jackson, who ran the business breakfast. Give Jonathan a big hand. Shut up, Johnny, our national spokesman. And my classmate, Brother Gary Masoni. Shut up, Gary Masoni. Give it up for Gary. And Bill Dickerson. Give it up, Bill. Give it up for Bill Dickerson. We were able to get an extra 30 minutes today on Impact Television. Will be seen in homes all around the world today. Brian has a message to deliver. He has built the most strategic museum in world history for African people. I go now in one of my introductions, Brian, I will ask, how many of you remember your grandparents? Hands go up. I knew Grandma. Great-grandparents, about half of them come down. Great, and they drop. Fifth generation, and no hands go up. Jesus, to David in the first chapter of Matthew, was 1,000 years. We will have been here 400 years next year. What would 1,000 years take us to? Say Jesus to David, it's 1,000 years. David to Moses, it's 2,000 years. Jesus quoted Moses. Jesus quoted David. His first sermon was from Isaiah 700 years before. And so there's a darkness, they call it the nadir. And Brian has illuminated the darkness of our existence in this country. And we're going to talk about what that means. I want Audrey DuBois Harris now to sing for us. And the next voices you will hear will be that of Dr. Brian Stevens, one of the ablest lawyers, freedom fighters in the world today. Brian, we thank you and we appreciate you. I want to say that there are three families here today who were victims of 57 lynchings in Illinois. Bobby Rush is here, who was a victim of an attempted lynching. They lynched Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. Extrajudicial killing led by the state's attorney. They killed them in their sleep. That's a lynching. And Bobby Rush would have been lynched, except God had him in another place that night. And the reason Bobby is survived, Bobby came to push breadbasket on a Saturday morning and turn himself in to the public. And Bobby is designing the lynching. Say, lynching is not yet a federal crime. Bobby Rush is designing the lynching must be a federal crime. Number two, ban assault weapons. Number three, the constitutional right to vote. Number four, take Jeff Sessions to a real Sunday school. A distorted theology affects our sociology. The fact of the matter is that Jesus, when the word went out they were going to kill the firstborn babies, Mary and Joseph escaped to Egypt. They didn't separate Jesus from Mary and Joseph. Egyptians had enough humanity. So to separate families at the border is a crime against humanity. Audrey, you and Brother Damien take us to the next voice you would hear would be that of Brian Stevens.
this race. Hold my hand while I run this race. Hold my hand, Lord, while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. Oh, stand by me, Lord, while I run this race. Stand by me, Lord, while I run this race. Stand by me, my Lord, while I run this hill race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. Oh, fight, Lord, I need you to fight for me. Oh, yes, while I run this race. Oh, fight for me, Lord, while I run this race. Hallelujah. Fight. I need you to fight
my. Y'all may have to just give me a moment here. We have 2.3 million people in jails and prisons in this country. There are 6 million people on probation or parole. There are 70 million people in this country who have criminal arrests, which means that when they try to get jobs and they try to get loans, they're often disfavored. We've put a tremendous number of women in jails and prisons over the last quarter century. The percentage of women going to prison has increased 646% in the last 25 years. We have hundreds of thousands of people in this country denied the right to vote because of a criminal conviction. The Bureau of Justice now says that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. We have record levels of poverty. There is despair. I meet 12 and 13-year-old children who sometimes tell me that they don't expect to be free by the time they're 21. That's how intense the expectation of incarceration has become in our country. We're dealing with despair and anguish. We're being governed by people who've lost their way. There is all of this darkness, and I feel this burden. And I'm going to be honest with you, each morning I wake up burdened by what I'm seeing in so many parts of our country, and I fall on my knees and I ask God, guide my feet while I run this race. I pray for guidance because I feel this burden. So this morning, I'm so blessed, I'm so touched by your song, by your voice, to be in this place with my friend, my mentor, my hero, Reverend Jackson. I'm delighted to be here with you. And I want to talk about identity today, because I believe identity matters. When you're a school teacher, it matters what kind of teacher you are. There are words we put in front of the labels we wear as teachers or business people or doctors or whatever it is. If we're a compassionate teacher, if we're a thoughtful teacher, if we're a caring teacher, we're the kind of teacher that can make a difference in the lives of other people. If we're a thoughtful doctor, if we're a compassionate doctor, we're the kind of doctor that can make a difference in the lives of people. If we're a praying believer, if we're a worshiping believer, if we're a serving believer, we make a difference in the kinds of people. Our witness has resonance that the witness that other people don't have. So today I want to talk about what kind of identity we're going to create in this country, in this community, in this world. And I've learned some things about the power of identity, not from my work, but from my grandmother. I talk about my grandmother a lot. I'm the grandchild of this amazing woman. My grandmother was the traditional African-American matriarch. She was the power in our family. She was tough. She was strong. She was intimidating at times. She was the daughter of people who were enslaved. And my grandmother had this way about her. She had 10 children, and she just had these qualities. My grandmother was actually the end of every argument in our family. She was also the start of a lot of arguments in our family. And my grandmother had these qualities. When I was a little boy, my grandmother would come up to me and she'd give me these hugs and she'd squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. And then I'd see my grandmother an hour later and she'd look at me, she'd say, "Brian, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again. And if I said yes, she'd let me be. And by the time I was 10, my grandmother had taught me every time I would see her, I'd say, "Mama, I'll always feel you hugging me." And the difficulty was she had 10 children, and my aunts and uncles had a lot of kids, and so there were dozens of cousins competing for her attention. And one morning, I was spending time with her, and my cousins were running around, and I came into the living room. My grandmother was sitting across the room, and she was staring at me. I couldn't figure out why is she staring at me like that. And after a few minutes, my grandmother got up, and she walked across the room, and she took me by the hand. She said, "Come on, Brian, you and I are going to have a talk." And she took me out back. I remember this just like it happened yesterday. And she sat me down and she said, "Brian, I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell anybody what I tell you." I said, "Okay, Mama." And then my grandmother looked at me and she said, "Brian, I've been watching you and I think you're special." She said, "I think you can do anything you want to do." And I remember just looking up at my grandmother while she said these things, and then she said, "Brian, you can do anything you want to do, but you're going to have to promise me 3 things. I said, "Okay, Mama." She said, "The first thing I want you to promise me is that you'll always love my mother, your mother." She said, "That's my daughter. I need you to promise me you're going to take care of her no matter what." I adored my mom, so I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And then my grandmother looked at me and she said, Brian, the second thing I need you to promise me is that you'll always do the right thing, even when the right thing is the hard thing. I said, yes, Mama, I'll do that. I was about 9 or 10 years old, and then my grandmother looked at me, she said, Brian, the last thing I need you to promise me is that you'll never drink alcohol. Well, I was 10 years old, so I said, yes, Mama, I'll do that. I have a brother who's a year older and a sister who's a year younger, and as we got older, my brother, when we were teenagers, came home one day and he'd gotten beer somewhere. I don't know where he got this beer. But he grabbed me and my sister and he took us out back and he had some beer and he gave some to my sister and she had some and they offered it to me, and I was thinking about this promise and I said, no, I'm not going to have any beer. Y'all go ahead. And my brother said, come on, I'm having beer, your sister's having beer, have some beer. I said, no, Mom, no, that's okay, I'm not going to do that. My brother was staring at me. He said, come on, do this. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And then my brother looked at me real hard and he said, I hope you're not still hung up on that conversation Mama had with you. I said, what are you talking about? He says, oh, Mama tells all the grandchildren that they're special and makes them these promises. I was devastated. But I'm going to tell you something this morning. I'm in my 50s. And I'm gonna admit something I probably shouldn't admit. I've been living a little while longer here, but I'm gonna tell you something this morning. I've never had a drop of alcohol in my life. And I don't say that because I think there's something virtuous about that. I say that because there's power in identity. When we create the kind of identity that means something to the people around us, we can say things that other people may not get. We can do things that other people may not see, but it will make a difference. When I thought about my grandmother and what she represented, I could not shake that identity. And so I want us to create an identity in this country where we begin to say things that resonate when we talk about justice and hope. When we talk about our tomorrows, and our identity is critical. Now, we're going through an identity crisis in America right now. We're saying a lot of things that don't make sense. We're doing things that are contradictory. We've lost our way. And so I want to talk about what it will take us to create a new identity. And the first thing I'm persuaded we're going to have to do is we're going to have to get proximate to people who are in the margins. You see, a lot of people think that the recipe for finding our way forward is to create wealth and power and to isolate ourselves in wealthy and powerful neighborhoods and to create distance from the places where people are suffering and struggling. We think that the more we have, the more space we can create from the problems that we see around us. And this morning, I'm going to argue the opposite. You see, I think our power is rooted in proximity. Those of us who understand the real identity that we're seeking are going to have to find ways to make sure we stay close to the poor, the excluded. I spend my time in jails and prisons because I am persuaded that it's proximity to the incarcerated and the condemned that teaches me things that I need to understand. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. In my county, there were no high schools for black teenagers when my dad went to school. He couldn't go to high school. And then lawyers came into our community and made it possible for me to go to high school. And I got to go to college, I got to go to law school. And I didn't really have a good experience my first year in law school. I was struggling, I couldn't make sense of it. It seemed distant and disconnected from the issues that motivated me to want to be a lawyer. I was concerned about inequality and social injustice and racial inequality, and it didn't seem like they were talking about those things. And I was struggling, and at a certain period of time, I actually began to think that I couldn't be the kind of lawyer I wanted to be. I began to do this thing I'm going to urge all of you to never do, where I tried to rationalize accepting a career as a lawyer that I knew was not going to be fulfilling, that I knew my heart wasn't going to be animated by. I was trying to make sense of a career path that wasn't really for me. And then I got proximate. I took a course that required me to spend a month working with death row prisoners in Georgia. And I went to this human rights organization and I saw these lawyers getting up early in the morning and working hard all day, and they were animated by their work, and I began to get inspired by that model. And then they asked me to go to death row and meet someone that they hadn't had time to meet. They said, Brian, go on down there and just explain to this man that he's not at risk of execution. I got in the car to drive down to death row, and I have to tell you, I was nervous, I was anxious, I was overwhelmed. I didn't think this man would want to hear from just a law student. I tried to prepare exactly what I was going to say to this man, but I was so nervous. I parked the car, I went into the prison, they took me to the back. When I got back there, I tried to rehearse again what I was going to say, and finally, They brought the condemned man into the visitation room. He had handcuffs on his wrists. He had a chain around his waist. He had shackles on his ankles. I was struck by the chains he wore. It took them 10 minutes to get these chains off of him. And finally, he walked over to me. And when he walked over, I was so nervous. I just said, "I'm so sorry. I'm just a law student. I don't know much about the death penalty. I don't know much about the procedures. But I'm here because they told me to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year." And as soon as I said that, the man grabbed my hands and he said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." He asked me to say it again. I said, "I don't know what you mean." He said, "I need you to say what you just said again." I said, "You're not at risk of execution." And he grabbed my hands again and he said, "Thank you." Then he said, "Say it again." I said, "You're not at risk of execution." And that's when this man hugged me and he said, "You know, you're the first person I've met in the 2 years I've been on death row who's not a death row prisoner or death row guard." He said, "I've been talking to my wife and my kids on the phone, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid they'd show up. And I'd have an execution date and I didn't want them to have to deal with that." He said, "Now because of you, I'm going to see my wife, I'm going to see my kids." And this man and I started talking and it turned out we had exactly the same birth date, same month, same day, same year. He started asking me questions about my life. I started asking him questions about his life. We got lost in conversation and 1 hour turned into 2 hours, 2 hours turned into 3 hours, and we were still talking. I'd only scheduled to be there for an hour. And the guards got angry, and after 3 hours, they couldn't take it any longer, so they came bursting into the room, and they were mad. And they grabbed this man, and they roughly threw him against the wall. They pulled his arms back. They put the handcuffs on his wrists. They wrapped the chain around his waist. I could see the metal digging in his skin. I begged them to be gentle. I said, "Look, it's not his fault. It's my fault." But they ignored me. They shoved him against the wall, and they began putting the shackles on his ankles. The condemned man looked at me, and he said, "Brian, don't you worry about this. You just come back." And then I watched these officers roughly push this man toward the door. They almost knocked him down, and I was looking in horror, feeling bad about what they were doing to him as they moved him near the door. And then when they got him near the door, I watched this man do something, and I never will forget it. I saw him plant his feet. And the next time when they tried to move him, he didn't move. And then that condemned man looked at me and he said, "Brian, don't you worry about this. You just come back." And then that man did something I will never, ever forget. I stood there and I watched him close his eyes. And then he threw his head back and then he began to sing. He started singing this hymn. He started singing, "I'm pressing on the upward way." He said, "New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound." And then he said, "Lord, plant my feet on higher ground." Everybody stopped. The guards were covered. They started pushing him down the hallway. You could hear the chains clanging, but you could hear this condemned man singing about higher ground. And I'm a witness today that when I heard that man sing, everything changed for me. That's when I knew I wanted to be a lawyer that helped condemned people get to higher ground. And I realized that not only did I want to help condemned people get to higher ground, I realized that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. I realized that I can't get there if he doesn't get there. When I went back to Harvard Law School, I was a different kind of law student. You couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about comedy and federalism and procedure. If I'm any kind of lawyer at all, it's because I heard a condemned man sing about getting to higher ground. And I tell you that because I believe our power, the answers, the changes, our quest to create the true American identity isn't in Washington. It's not in the best parts of town. It's in poor communities where the poor are suffering. It's in jails and prisons. It's in the difficult places. And when we are proximate to those places, we understand things that we cannot understand any other way. There's power in proximity. A lot of people say, "Oh, that's a bad part of town. Stay as far away as you can." I'm the opposite. I want us to get closer to the parts of our community where there's suffering, where children are being traumatized, where there are too many guns, where there's too much fear, where there's too much addiction and dependency, where there's all of this violence. We've got to get proximate. And in proximity, we create an identity that resonates. It means something. Those words in the church aren't just rhetoric. They're not just hymns. When they talk about being near the cross, when they talk about being at the cross, when they talk about down on my knees, they're talking about proximity. And when we are closer to those who are suffering, we begin to do the things that are necessary to create the kind of identity. But proximity is not enough by itself. The second thing I am persuaded we have to do, we have to work on these narratives. You see, underneath the policies and the issues, there are narratives, there are stories that we don't always acknowledge. And if we don't talk about those narratives, we don't actually make the progress we need to make. You see, we have mass incarceration in this country because we declared a misguided war on drugs. We said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent are criminals. Now, we didn't have to say that. We could have said that addiction and dependency is a healthcare problem. But instead of calling it a healthcare problem, we said it's a crime problem, and we've locked up hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons. Now, the reason why we did that has to do with a narrative. Alcoholism, we say that's a disease. And if we know someone who's an alcoholic and we see them going to a bar, we don't call the police. No, but for addiction and dependency, we said, no, that's a crime, and we put people in jails and prisons, but it has to do with a narrative. Underneath the policy debate, there's a narrative. And at the time, our politicians were preaching the politics of what I call the politics of fear and anger. They wanted everybody afraid and they wanted everybody angry, and we allowed ourselves to be governed by fear and anger. And I am persuaded that if we're going to create a new change, a new America, a new direction, if we're going to create the kind of identity as believers who understand what it takes to create real justice, we're going to have to change these narratives. We cannot allow ourselves to be governed by fear and anger. Fear and anger are the essential ingredients of oppression and inequality. Go anywhere in the world where there's oppression, ask the oppressors why they do what they do. They'll give you a narrative of fear and anger, and believers, we're going to have to resist the politics of fear and anger. If we have faith, we've got to understand that our faith should make us strong and courageous. We don't have to fear. We don't have to just be angry. We've got something else. And changing that narrative is key. But we also cannot move forward in this country until we change the narrative about race, about our history of racial inequality. You know, I've been talking about this a lot, but I don't think we're free in this country. Not just black people, but everybody. We're all burdened by a history of racial inequality that is so corruptive that it's created a kind of smog in the other air. It's another kind of environmental problem that we have in America. You see, this history of racial inequality has created this pollution, and we all breathe it in. And it doesn't matter whether you were born and raised in another country, it doesn't take long before you get infected with this corruption. And what that means is that we're going to have to talk about some things that we haven't talked about before. I believe we have to talk about the fact that we live in a post-genocide society. You see, I think what happened to native people when Europeans came to this continent was a genocide. We had 10 million native people on this continent, and we slaughtered them by the millions through famine and war and disease. It was a genocide, but we didn't call it a genocide. We said, no, those native people, we said they're savages. We created this narrative of racial difference to justify our violence and abuse. And that narrative of racial difference was the very first thing we did in this country. And it shaped our economic policies and social policies and political policies and cultural policies. You see, this narrative of racial differences at the very core of how our country evolved. And it was because of that experience with native people that we got comfortable enslaving black people. You see, when you were acculturated and born into a nation where that narrative of racial difference shaped the worldview, you didn't see a problem with putting people in chains and enslaving them and humiliating them and abusing them. But I am persuaded that the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude. It wasn't forced labor. Sometimes we've talked about slavery, in my judgment, in the wrong way. The great evil of American slavery wasn't the servitude and the forced labor. The true evil of American slavery was this narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy that we created to justify enslavement. The real evil was this notion that was created that black people aren't fully human. They're not like other people. They can't do this, they can't do that. They don't feel this, they don't feel that. They can't be this, they can't be that. And that narrative of racial difference, that ideology of white supremacy, that was the true evil of American slavery. And when you read the 13th Amendment, it talks about ending involuntary servitude. It talks about ending forced labor, but it doesn't say anything about ending this narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy. And because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism and violence. And what happened between 1865 and World War II has to be understood as racial terrorism, because black people were pulled out of their homes. They were burned, they were drowned, they were lynched, they were murdered all over the South. 90% of the African American population lived in the Deep South at the turn of the century. And for the next several decades, they were terrorized, they were threatened, they were menaced, and no one said anything about it. Congress didn't do anything, law enforcement didn't do anything, and that terror is what shaped the demographic geography of this nation. Chicago has a large African American population, but we don't talk about how black people came here. Older people of color come up to me sometimes, they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. And if we don't understand this demographic geography that we've created in this country, we don't understand the problems that ensued. And that means we have to talk about the fact that the black people in Chicago, the black people in Cleveland, the black people in Detroit, the black people in Los Angeles, the black people in Oakland, in Boston, in Minneapolis did not go to these communities as immigrants. They went to these communities, came to these communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And there's a line from Chicago to Mississippi, and Chicago to Alabama, and Chicago to Louisiana, and on that line is this blood and the sweat and the anguish of millions of African American families that were forced off that land. We talk about a wealth gap in America, but we don't talk about why. At the end of emancipation, there were skilled black farmers. They knew a lot about agriculture. They knew a lot about blacksmithing. They had crafts and trades and skills that they had developed during emancipation, and they were prepared to create wealth like other immigrant communities, but they were denied the right to vote. And when they were so good at their farming that they began to do better than the white farmers, they would be lynched. And when their businesses got so good that other people wanted their businesses, they would be lynched. When they tried to actually organize and do things in a more efficient and effective way, they would be lynched. And if you want to understand why there's a wealth gap in America, you have to understand the history of lynching. You see, it was terror that tied. And then when black folks came to Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit, we weren't welcome. We were put in ghettos and we were excluded from jobs. We weren't given the same kind of opportunities. And when our fighters went to Europe and fought in World War I and World War II, and they came back, they didn't get the benefits of the GI Bill. They didn't get the same opportunities for mortgage loans. And we have to understand this history if we're going to understand where we are. And then we had that heroic movement led by extraordinary people, Dr. King, Reverend Jackson, so many others did such extraordinary things. But even here, I think I'm worried. I'm going to just be honest. And I don't want to get in trouble, but I'm just a little bit concerned about how we talk about civil rights in this country. I am. I think we've gotten too celebratory when we talk about the civil rights movement. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it's starting to sound like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we changed these laws and racism was over. And it would be great if that's our history, but that's not our history. Our history is that for decades, black people were told you can't vote, you can't do this, you can't do that. And when black people came to Chicago, they met the same kind of bigotry and racism that they had faced in Mississippi and South Carolina. It's when Dr. King was in Chicago after the passage of the Voting Rights Act that people were throwing things and taunting things. That's not our history. Those signs that said white and colored, they weren't directions, they were assaults. They created injuries, and we haven't treated those injuries. And that narrative of racial difference persists. And today, we're still dealing with that narrative. And there's a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets assigned to black and brown people. And I've been giving these commencement addresses, and it breaks my heart to be in these colleges and to look out at the graduates, some of whom are black and brown, and have to say to them, even though you finished your degree at Johns Hopkins, even though you finished your degree at Princeton, even though you finished your degree at Spelman, doesn't matter how educated you are, doesn't matter how kind you are, you will go places in this country where you're going to be presumed dangerous and guilty just because of your color. And the older I've gotten, the more the burden of that presumption is starting to weigh on me. I'll be honest. I was in a courtroom not too long ago. I was doing a hearing in the Midwest. And I had my suit and tie on. I was there early. I tried to get there early. I was sitting at defense counsel's table. I hadn't been in this courtroom before. And the judge walked in and he saw me sitting there and he got angry. I couldn't figure out why he was angry. And then he said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. You wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendants in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and I had to apologize. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Brian Stevenson. I'm the lawyer." I didn't want to disadvantage my client, so I said, "Please, Your Honor, I'm sorry. I didn't introduce myself." And then the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing. And then they brought my client. It was actually a young white kid I was representing. And I did the hearing, but afterward I was thinking, what is it when this judge saw a middle-aged black man in a suit and tie? It didn't even occur to him that's the lawyer. What that is this narrative of racial difference. And if it's happening to me, and I've argued all of these cases to the United States Supreme Court, I try to do all of this work. If it's happening to me, it's happening to everybody. And we've got to change this presumption. We've got to change this narrative. When you go to South Africa, I'm so glad that there are people from South Africa here, because in Johannesburg, there is an apartheid museum. When you go to the Constitutional Court, there are emblems and symbols that are determined, that are there, so because South Africans don't want anyone to forget the scourge of apartheid. It is urgent and necessary in South Africa that they never forget the hardship and the horror of apartheid. Go to Rwanda. In Rwanda, the Rwandans will insist on talking to you about the genocide. Doesn't matter why you're going there, for business, for entertainment, for tourism, no matter what it is, they will talk to you about the genocide. They feel it too intensely to not talk about it. There's a genocide museum in Kigali that actually has human skulls. That's how desperately they want to express their pain. Go to Berlin, Germany. In Berlin, you can't go 100 meters without seeing a marker or a stone that's been placed next to the home of a Jewish family. There are monuments everywhere. The Germans want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial. They want to reflect on that history. They're trying to change the narrative. They don't want to be thought of as Nazis and fascists forever. They're trying to change the narrative. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. There are no icons to the members of the Third Reich in Germany. They're trying to change the narrative. They're talking about the Holocaust. But in this country, we haven't talked about slavery. We haven't talked about lynching. We're not talking about segregation. You start talking about race and people get nervous. You start talking about racial justice, they're looking for the exits. And we've got to change this narrative. The silence must end. It must end. And that is the reason we've built this museum in Montgomery, and I want all of you to come and visit. All of us have some lines down here in the Deep South. Don't think like you're not connected to the American South. We're all connected there. And we want you to come back, and we want you to see these spaces. When we begin talking about this history, when we talk about these things, things can change. I really do believe our country is in desperate need of truth-telling. And I believe in truth and reparation. I believe in truth and restoration. I believe in truth and reconciliation. I just believe that these things are sequential. You've got to first have truth before you can have reconciliation. It doesn't work any other way. And so we want to tell the truth about what has happened in this country. And if we change this narrative, if we talk honestly, not only will we begin to see some things, I also think our community needs it too. You see, there are a lot of black folks that don't want to talk about this history either. They somehow feel diminished by it. I understand a little bit about what that means. When I got to Harvard Law School, I didn't want people to know I started my education in a colored school. I didn't want them to know I'd never met a lawyer until I got to law school. I didn't want them to know my great-grandparents were enslaved. I thought somehow it would make me look bad. And then when I realized how far away I was moving, how lost I was getting, and then I went to death row and I met that condemned prisoner, that's when I realized that my identity, my history is not a source of shame, it's a source of power. And I realized that it was because I didn't know any lawyers. It was because my great parents were enslaved. It was because I started my education in a colored school that I had a place to do. I had some things I had to do, and there's power in recognizing that we are not just those who've been enslaved and lynched and segregated. We are those who have survived slavery, survived lynching, survived segregation. There's a power in our community that we need to acknowledge, but we can't even acknowledge it until we understand that history. That narrative has to change. Third thing, we can't create the kind of identity we need if we're unwilling to stay hopeful. You know, Reverend Jackson talks about keep hope alive. It's not just a slogan. It is a requirement. We cannot become truth tellers. We cannot become change agents. We cannot be perpetrators of this legacy and inherency we have received if we are unwilling to stay hopeful. And I'm really serious about this. You've got to examine yourself and make sure you are hopeful about something you can do in your school or in your church or in your community, because if you're not thinking hopefully about what you're going to do, I'm going to be honest with you, you're the problem. I believe that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists, and you're either hopeful or you're the problem. And so you've got to fight against the things that are making you hopeless. And I understand there are all these things attacking us all the time. Don't get me wrong, I understand it. But we've got to fight against it, because hope is our superpower. You see, it was hope that got the enslaved to survive, the lynched to persevere. There is power in hope. Hope is what will get you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what will get you to speak when other people say be quiet. There is something transformative in hope. I like telling this story. When I was a young lawyer, I moved to Montgomery, Alabama, and I had the great privilege of meeting these wonderful people. I met this amazing woman named Johnny Carr. Everybody needs to know who Johnny Carr is. She is the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And when I moved there in the 80s, Ms. Carr called me up. She said, "Brian, understand you're a young lawyer, just moved to town." I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." And then she said, "Well, if you're a young lawyer, just moved to town, sometimes I'm going to ask you to go some places and speak." And then she said, "Sometimes I'm going to ask you to go to some places and listen." And then she said, "Brian, when I call you up and ask you to go some places to speak or go some places and listen, what you're going to do is say, 'Yes, ma'am.'" So I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she would send me places to speak and send me places to listen. And then one day she called me up. She said, "Brian, Rosa Parks is coming to town. We're going to get together over at Virginia Durr's house." Virginia Durr is a white woman whose husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. She said, "Do you want to come over and listen?" I said, "Oh, yes, ma'am, I do." And I went over there and I listened to Rosa Parks and Virginia Durr and Johnny Carr in their 80s talking for almost 2 hours. And the amazing thing was that they weren't talking about things that they had done. They were talking about the things they were still going to do. And each one of them had this hope that they could still make a difference. And I remember sitting there soaking this all in. And finally, Ms. Parks turned to me. She said, "Now, Brian, tell me about the Equal Justice Initiative. Tell me what you're trying to do." And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And so then I turned to Ms. Parks and I gave her my rap. I said, "Ms. Parks, we're trying to end the death penalty. We're trying to help children in jails and prisons. We're trying to challenge conditions of confinement. We're trying to do something about poverty. We're trying to do something about race. We're trying to help the mentally ill. We're trying to help those who are disabled. We're trying to help those who are disfavored." I gave her my whole rap, and when I finished, she looked at me. She said, She said, "That's going to make you tired, tired, tired." And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger on my face and she said, "That's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave." You see, hope requires courage. It requires courage. But when we are courageous and hopeful, that's when we create a kind of identity that can make a difference. And so this community of people that we are going to continue being, who are proximate to the excluded, who are changing narratives, who are hopeful, have only one more thing to do. The last thing we're going to have to do, if we're going to create a kind of identity that allows us to be worthy heirs of this legacy that people like Reverend Jackson have created for us, we're going to have to be willing to do this fourth thing, which is to do things that are inconvenient and uncomfortable. And I hate talking about this because I know it's hard, and I know we're human, and humans are programmed to do what's comfortable and convenient. But here this morning, I'm here as a witness to tell you that we cannot change the world. We can't create justice. We can't make a difference if we're unwilling to do things that are inconvenient and uncomfortable. And I've tried to kind of research my way out of this one. I'll be honest. I looked for some examples where equality triumphed, where the oppression was ended, where justice prevailed, and nobody had to do anything inconvenient or uncomfortable. But I can't find any examples of that. It only happens when good people are willing to do difficult things. And I say this with some context, with some consciousness. I've had the privilege of representing lots of people, and we've won a lot of cases. We've gotten the Supreme Court to ban mandatory life without parole sentences for children, and every time I come to Chicago, I meet somebody who was a juvenile condemned to die in prison who's now out, and it always encourages me and it affirms me. And I've had this great, wondrous career standing next to people who were wrongly convicted who are released, but I will also tell you, I've had some difficult days. Some years ago, we had a lot of people facing execution. We execute people in Alabama. And there was a man facing execution scheduled in 30 days, and he didn't have a lawyer, and we made the commitment to represent anybody who didn't have a lawyer. And I got involved in this man's case, and I quickly learned that he was scheduled to be executed in 30 days, and then I discovered that he suffered from intellectual disability. And I quickly went to the court because our courts have actually banned the execution of people with intellectual disability. And I said to the judge, you can't execute him, he's intellectually disabled. But the trial judge said, too late. I said, no, judge, it's not too late. And the court said, no, too late. Should have been filed earlier. And I went to the state court and they said too late. And the appeals court said too late. And the federal court said too late. Every court I went to said too late. And we got down to the day of the execution. And I was waiting to hear from the United States Supreme Court. I was pacing in my office back and forth, and finally the phone rang. And when the phone rang about an hour before the scheduled execution, it was the clerk. And she told me that our motion had been reviewed by the justices, had been considered by the court. And then she told me that the judgment of the court was that our motion for a stay of execution was due to be denied. Too late. So then I had to do the hard thing, the most difficult thing I have to do. I got on the phone and I picked up the phone and I had to tell this man, I said, I'm so sorry, but I can't stop this execution. And then this man did the thing I dread the most in my work. He began to cry. And within a few minutes, he began to sob. And I was holding the phone while this condemned man was just sobbing on the phone. And then he said to me, he said, Mr. Stevenson, please don't hang up. He said, I've got something really important I need to say to you. I said, of course. And then this man tried to say something to me, but in addition to being intellectually disabled, he had another challenge. When he got nervous, when he got anxious, when he got overwhelmed, he had a speech impediment. And he would begin to stutter terribly. And all of a sudden, he could not get out a single word. He kept trying to say something. He kept trying to talk, but he couldn't get his words out. And it was so overwhelming and uncomfortable and inconvenient that I didn't know what to do. I was just standing there, and before I realized it, tears were running down my face. This man was struggling to get his words out. And my mind actually wandered. That's how painful it was. I actually remembered, I started thinking about when I was a little boy and my mom had taken me to church one Sunday. And at church one Sunday, as a little boy, I was talking to my friends, and there was a little kid standing there, and this little skinny kid didn't say anything. He was just standing there. And I remembered on the night of this execution turning to this little boy and saying, what's your name? Where are you from? And then I remembered on the night of this execution that when that little boy tried to answer my question, he also stuttered terribly. And I remembered with pain and agony that when that little boy couldn't get his words out right, I did something really ignorant. I laughed. And my mother saw me laughing at this little boy, and she came over and she pulled me aside and she took me over to the back and she said, Brian, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that. And I felt bad, and I tried to apologize, but my mother said, no, Brian, you're not going to apologize to me. You've got to apologize to him. And my mother looked at me. She said, now you go back over there and you tell that little boy you're sorry. I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and then my mom grabbed me by the arm. She said, wait, after you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy. I kind of rolled my eyes, but I said, okay, Mom. And then I took a step, and then she grabbed me again. She said, wait, after you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him. I said, Mom, I can't go over there and tell that little boy I love him. She gave me that look again. And so I went over to this little boy, and I remembered on the night of this execution walking up to this little boy saying, look, man, I'm sorry. And then I sort of lunged at him and gave him my little boy version of a man hug. And then I tried to say to this child as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, look, man, I don't know. Well, I don't know. Well, I love you. And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back. And then he whispered flawlessly in my ear, and what he said to me was, I love you too. And I was thinking about that while this client was trying to get his words out, and finally my client got his words out. He said, Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for representing me. He said, I want to thank you for fighting for me. And the last thing he said, Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life. They pulled that man away, and they strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. I hung up the phone. I said, I can't do this anymore. It's too uncomfortable. It's too much. It's too painful. I just can't do it anymore. I kept thinking about how broken he was. And the question I had in my mind is, why do we want to kill all the broken people in this country? What is it about us that when we see brokenness, we get angry, and when we want to crush it and hurt it? And then I began realizing things I hadn't realized before. And what I realized is that I represent broken people. All of my clients are the broken. They've been broken by poverty, broken by despair, broken by dysfunction, broken by racism, broken by poverty. And then I realized that I work in a broken system. The people with power are unwilling to get proximate. They've lost their hope. They're locked into narratives of fear and anger. And in that moment, I said, I don't want to do this anymore. And I sat down, and something told me, you better think about why you do what you do. And in that moment of agony, I was just sitting there, and then all of a sudden, I had this realization that I've never had before. And in that moment of agony, I realized why I do what I do, and it shocked me. It just shocked me, because what I realized is that I don't do what I do because I've been trained as a lawyer. I don't do what I do because somebody has to do it. I don't do what I do because if I don't do it, no one will. What I realized that night is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is that when you stay on the battlefield, when you ask God to guide your feet, when you fight every day, when you get proximate, when you change narratives, when you stay hopeful, there are going to be moments when you get pushed and cut and brutalized. We cannot do this work because we feel like we're perfect and whole and right. It's in brokenness that we do this work. And then I realized I'm not just trying to save the condemned. I'm not just trying to save the excluded. I'm trying to save myself. I'm trying to save everybody. I really believe very simple things. I think that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. Even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And justice requires that we understand the other things you are. I don't believe that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I don't. I am persuaded that the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we do justice, we do the things that are necessary. And I don't believe our churches are going to be judged by how we treat the powerful and the rich and the privileged. Our churches are going to be judged by how we treat the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. And I'm going to be honest, God has been working with me. I'm not going to tell you any lies. He's been working with me. And I feel like he's been asking me to prepare a case. Because right now in America, they're putting grace on trial. We don't believe in redemption anymore. We don't believe in justice anymore. We don't believe in fairness anymore. And I think God is asking me to get ready. He's saying, Brian, I may need you to represent me in court. And so I'm trying to get my head ready for the grace on trial, for the grace on redemption. And I want the theologians to be ready. I want the preachers to be ready. I want the priests to be ready. But beloved, my first witnesses in the trial for grace are going to be the broken among us. It's going to be the poor, the incarcerated, the condemned. Those are my first witnesses. And so today I want to just say to you, if you're broken, if you're shattered, if you've been hurt, if you've been injured, if you've fallen down, you are exactly who God needs to create an identity. I'll end with this. We know something in our community that we should never forget. And what we understand is that our wounds and our injuries sometimes make us stronger. They make us the kind of perfect people to be God's representatives. I gave a talk in a church. This older man came into the church, older black man. He was in a wheelchair. He was sitting in the back. He was staring at me. He had this harsh look on his face. I couldn't figure out, why is he staring at me so harshly? And I got through my talk, and people came up, and they were very appropriate, but that older man was still sitting in the back, and he looked at me so hard. And then he wheeled himself to the front of the church, and when he got in front of me, he put his hand up. He said, do you know what you're doing? And I just stood there. Then he asked me again. He said, do you know what you're doing? I mumbled something. Then he asked me, he said, do you know what you're doing? And then he said, I'm going to tell you what you're doing. And that older man looked at me and he said, you're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice. And I was so moved. I was also really relieved. I just didn't know what was about to happen. Then that man grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, come here, I'm going to show you something. And this older man turned his head. He said, you see this scar I have behind my right ear? He said, I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head, he said, you see this cut I have down here at the bottom of my neck? Got that in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head, he said, you see this dark spot? He said, that's my bruise. Got my bruise in Birmingham, 1965, trying to register people to vote. Then he looked at me, he said, I'm going to tell you something, young man. He said, people look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars. He said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, these are not my cuts. He said, these are not my bruises. These are not my scars. He said, these are my medals of honor. And so I want us to honor what it means to be the children of the enslaved, the children of the lynched, the children of the segregated, to take these bruises and cuts and scars and fight for justice, keep hope alive, get proximate, do uncomfortable things, and turn these wounds into medals of honor. God bless all of you.
in troubled times. Seems like the sun won't shine. When will we realize that God is on our side? Oh yes, we live in troubled times. Seems like the sun won't shine. When will we realize God is on our side? Oh yes. When will we realize that God is on our side? Hallelujah. God is on our side. God is on our side.
Brian Stevens. Put your hands together for Brian. Congressman Bobby Rush. Come here, please. Congressman Bobby Rush. Alana's the other family here today. Where's Alana? Danny Glover this one. Give Danny a big hand. Stand up, Danny. "57 families were lynched in Illinois, almost 500 in Mississippi. Bobby Rush, will y'all sit down over there? Like now? Was scheduled to be lynched. The state's attorney of our state, an extrajudicial killing, came to kill Bobby Rush. Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. Bob was not there. Brother Brian, Bobby Rush accepted responsibility from the caucus, putting together anti-lynching legislation. Lynching is not yet a federal crime. I want Danny Glover to come here and Brian, and let Bobby explain to you his legislation on making lynching a federal crime. Bobby, and Danny, and Brian.
Well, Reverend, it's because of you. It's because of that spirit which is in you. It's because of the God that is in you that you gave Danny Davis and I the charge of introducing an anti-lynching law within the federal government. And you came to the Congressional Black Caucus at our weekly luncheon, and you persuaded the Congressional Black Caucus to get behind the anti-lynching bill. And my staff, under my direction, immediately that same afternoon went to work and worked with members of Congress and worked with the various offices, and we crafted legislation, the anti-lynching legislation. It's H.R. 6068. House Resolution H.R. 6068. The anti-lynching legislation. When we introduced it, Reverend, on just this past Wednesday, because of you, and you bringing it to our attention, we introduced it with 35 of the 49 members of the Congressional Black Caucus as co-sponsors of this bill. Now, some may argue that lynching is over, that it's past history. Well, Brian has reminded us not only that Charlottesville was a year and a half ago, but that our narrative, it is never too late to change the narrative. And these times that we live in right now, who can say that a lynching might not occur this very afternoon somewhere in America? Tomorrow, lynching is a distinct possibility to occur somewhere in America. And we have got to make, for this time, we have got to make lynching against the federal laws of our nation. It just didn't start on last Wednesday. Back in 1915, a guy, a congressman out of Missouri named Leonidas Berry, he introduced an anti-lynching bill. And since that time, it's been over 200 anti-lynching bills that have been introduced in the Congress. They've all failed because we never fought to change, as Brian instructed us this morning, the narrative that allow lynching to be a part of our culture and a part of our nation. And so I'm just thankful, very thankful to Reverend Jackson, who had the insight, the intellect, the courage, the will to come and remind us all that in the year 2018, we still have lynching as a possibility, and lynching is not against the federal law. It's been referred to committee. I believe that Nancy Pelosi will get on this bill. I believe that in this era of Trump, that this bill, if you get behind it and if you work on it, if you do all that you can, if you commit yourself to changing this nation, this bill can become federal law. H.R. 6068. Thank you very much.
I want Brian to respond, since Brian inspired this new consciousness, and then Danny Glover, who works on forms of lynching around the world to respond to Brian. Brian?
Well, I do just want to thank Reverend Jackson, who came to Montgomery, spent time with us, and this idea was generated. There are a lot of things that we can say and do that I think are going to respond to this narrative challenge, and I'm grateful to Mr. Rush and all of the others who are pushing this thing forward. There are these things. A lot of people are going to say, well, we don't need that. That's a waste of time. There are actually a lot of critical things like this. That fact that we never passed a lynching law is a stain on our nation. And it hovers over, it contributes to that corruption. And so I do believe this is a critically important thing to do. There's some other things we're going to have to do as well. You know, a lot of people don't know in this country that the 13th Amendment doesn't totally abolish slavery. We actually still permit slavery for people convicted of crimes. The 13th Amendment says involuntary servitude and forced labor is unconstitutional except for people convicted of crimes. And I'm asking the question, don't we want to totally abolish slavery in America? Why wouldn't that be something that we ask our legislators and leaders to do? And it begins with these things like the lynching law, but there are these correctives that need to happen. There are these things that we need to do, and talking, I think, more honestly about this legacy is really important. So I think this gives us an opportunity to educate our nation about this history of lynching. I'm grateful, really grateful for the leadership and Reverend Jackson for you who initiated this, because we'll have an opportunity to share things that need to be shared that are going to get us closer. You know, when you think about where we are, and this is why it's so critically needed, here we are in this political moment where we have a president who campaigned on the slogan of Make America Great Again. And I'll be honest, as a student of history, I don't understand what decade African Americans are supposed to want to live again when I think about our history of slavery and lynching, and it wouldn't be an effective political slogan if we understood our history. And that's why talking about lynching and talking about slavery and talking about segregation is so critical. So my gratitude, Reverend Jackson, to push to Representative Rush, all of you for the leadership you're showing on this, and all these people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Thank you so much for your extraordinary words, Brian. James Baldwin said, when we cannot tell ourselves the truth about our past, we become trapped in it. And in thinking about the legislation, as certainly Bobby knows, Congressman Rush knows, and Brian knows, that Ida B. Wells in 1896 led an anti-lynching campaign. Oh, yes. And in 1946, Paul Robeson and Albert Einstein were part of an attempt to get a federal legislation for an anti-lynching campaign. Yes. You know, so the time is due. Brian said it tells us the truth, that we have to start with the truth. We have to have all the truth, no matter how long ago. So when the governor of Mississippi Alabama says that he doesn't think the Legacy Museum is important, is irrelevant, we need to forget the past. We cannot forget the past. Thank you.
Along this line, one of the persons that we are making an annual memorial to is Curt Flood. Jackie Robinson broke what was the color line of white baseball. There were 4 baseball leagues. There was the African American League, Latino and Japanese, and the white league called Major. All the blacks and Latinos who joined the white league called Major, none took apprenticeship. They all came as starters and all-stars. But the one who paid an ultimate price was Curt Flood. We're honoring him today. His wife is Judy Bass. When they want to sell Curt Flood against his will, and Curt said, I am not a slave. And he did not play baseball no more, but every free agent in the world today, because of Curt Flood. That's right. Judy, tell us the legislation that came out of Flood's, out of Curt's proposition.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for always being there to let the story be told. And I always think of my husband's story as one that was It's almost like Hidden Figures. And I also wanted to, my brain is still running with lynching. I mean, just the lynching. And I always think of lynching with a rope. But I think we have lynching right now, only it's with a bullet. And it's usually coming from a policeman. That's where it's usually coming from. And I think that part of our lynching, I just couldn't get it out. But my husband, Curt Flood, he's the father of free agency. He's the man who took a case all the way to the Supreme Court because there had to be a change. He wrote a letter to the commissioner of baseball stating, I am not a piece of property to be bought and sold irrespective of my wishes, and I'm going to see about changing it. And he took a case to the Supreme Court. People say he lost the case. He did not lose the case. The Supreme Court did not say yes, and they did not say no. They said, we cannot give you an answer. You have to take this to Congress because they're the ones who gave Major League Baseball all the privilege of all not having to deal with antitrust laws. So in 1998, after Curt had passed away for a year, Congress gave him an answer. And the answer was the Curt Flood Act. Bill number 21, signed by Bill Clinton, that took all the privileges away from Major League Baseball that Congress had given them almost over 100 years ago. And that is the reason why today we have free agency, because of Curt Flood. It took a black man to sue 26 billionaires who own baseball teams and a whole lot more. So, and I always want to make people understand also that Curt was a magnificent player. He's part of that first generation after Jackie Robinson. He had 7 consecutive Gold Gloves. He was the best center fielder in Major League Baseball. We're talking the 60s. He had 2 World Series rings, part of that first generation after Jackie Robinson. He still, to this day, holds the record, to this day. After he sued Major League Baseball, he was out of the game. So we're talking 1970. And to this day, he still holds the record for errorless games and errorless innings. No one has broken his record yet. He was an incredible person. I love speaking of him because he is my hero, and he changed the way. Wait, let me just tell you this real quick, and then we'll get off. Time magazine, in their Millennium issue for the change of the century, they named the 10 most influential athletes in the whole world. That's right. The whole world, for the whole century. And Curt Flood was one of those 10 men, because he changed the way business is done in all disciplines of sports. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
In other words, Jackie Robinson's top salary was $42,000 a year. He didn't have the option to leave the Dodgers to go to the highest bidder. He had no market value. He was a commodity. And white and black alike bought into slavery. And Curt Flood freed all of athletes. If you're a soccer player in Europe, if you are a racquetball, whatever you are, say whatever, athletes in the world today, they can bargain based upon the market value called free agency. It's because of Curt Flood sacrificed his life, his career, and broke up the plantation. Big hand for Curt Flood. I want to, Jeanette, you said something to me, my mind was drifting. Oh. Brian, we're giving you an award because this well because we're trying to look important.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. This has been such a wonderful, blessed day. I just want to thank all of you for your continuing work. PUSH is an amazing institution with an amazing history. When I talk about identity, I was thinking about Reverend Jackson, who for a lifetime has been saying things, been fighting. When you fight the way he fights and you do the things he does, when he says, I am somebody, it means something. And Reverend Jackson, I just want you to know that there are many of my clients who've been told their lives have no meaning. They've been told they are beyond hope, beyond redemption, beyond any chance of rehabilitation. And they've heard you say, I am somebody. And that witness and that legacy continues to inspire them. So I am so grateful to have an award that has anything to do with you and PUSH and all the amazing work that has happened here at this great institution. Thank you all very, very much.
We shall annually have the annual Kurt Flood Award as the Liberator Award in athletics. This year, it would ordinarily go to a guy like Kaepernick. But it's the first one, and that goes to Kurt's family. Judy?
Thank you so much. I do like to talk about my husband and what he's done. I really do. And I also would like to just I am now the ambassador for Major League Baseball Players Association. The union for the players. I work with the trust, and the men who play the game, or Kurt would say, when I get on the field, I work this game, I don't play this game. That's what he would say. But the men who do play this game are giving back to the communities. And part of the trust is giving out scholarships. They give out thousands of scholarships. They help all over the world, because the teams today are made up of people who come from all over the world in different ethnic groups. And so I'm happy to say I'm now with Major League Baseball Players Association, their union, as their ambassador. Thank you so much. Thank you.
While we're in this narrative change in business, we should start referring to our relatives as ancestors, not as slaves. They may have been the slave of the oppressor, but they were our ancestors. We have proximity to them. Is that what that means? That what proximity means? So no more slaves from us. Ancestors. Second piece is, why do whites embrace Joe Louis more than Jack Johnson? When Joe Louis beat Max Schmeling, he was beating the German that Americans could not beat. When Jack Johnson defeated Jim Jeffries and broke the back of racial superiority, and when Jack Johnson took his girlfriend across state, they got married. That was not a kidnap. That was his wife. Y'all got that point? And so my point is that as we work on these narratives and get our story together, I want all of you guys to take your seats for just a minute, please. Take your seats for just a minute, please. Danny, take my seat. I'm not sitting down anymore. Mr. Mahon, give us a little joy here.
Keep on learning. Soldiers, keep on warring.
On your feet.
World, keep on turning, 'cause it won't be too long. Come on, man.
y'all sit down for a minute, please. Gus Newport, I'm glad to see. Give Brother Gus, the first black mayor of Berkeley. Give it up for Gus. Now, this, when we will have finished, hear me now, hear me now, hear me now. Audrey, we thank you so much. We will have finished this today. We have our Love Fest. Out front, the Shy Lights, Independents, various artists, Reverend Jenkins and War. When we leave here, we're going out front and have our Love Fest in the streets, and we're going to be eating ribs and chicken and stuff in the street. When you take your break, we have our gift shop upstairs. We're selling these T-shirts. Now, let us pray. For the friend we have in Jesus, all our grief and sins to bear. Touch us in a special way today. There's something said or some song sang today. Take our hearts and our spirits to higher ground. Give us that special will to sacrifice and declare unapologetically, before I'll be a slave, I'll die. Be buried in my grave. Live above the cowardice of live at any cost. Life is worth living and worth giving for the next generation. Bless our organization and our efforts as we advance the cause for those who paid the price to make this day possible. Amen. Let me say to you, this year, November 6th is our date with destiny. We have the power this year to take the Congress, House, and Senate back. This year. We don't want to be confused about that. So this year is our year. Take the Congress back and send Trump to the apartments again. Yeah. Now, collection time. Collection. I'm so glad to see you. Look at my little niece. If you would give $100 or more, I want you to stand. We need your support. We had a very low price of cost for the convention. We did that because we wanted everybody to be accessible. Would you bring in some money? Would you go on the Warrior jersey? John Rogers, $2,500. Thank you, John. You'll give at least $100. Please stand wherever you are. We need your support. We need your support. We need your support. Brother Gator, my God, Gator, $100. Maddox Moore, $100. Thank you, Maddox. Reverend Patterson, $100. Shiloh Church. Mr. Bonita Carr, $200. Thank you, Bonita. Dr. Karen Weaver from Tougaloo. John. That's retribution money for cutting up downtown. Y'all got things squared away?
Tragedies are commonplace. All kinds of diseases, people are slipping away. Economy's down, people can't get enough pay.
You give it at least $100, please, doctor.
All I can say is thank you, Lord, for all you've done for me.
This is my niece singing, Felicia.
Oh, without homes. Oh, I hear
You'll give
the
these
streets.
$100, please stand.
Drug habits, some say.
You'll give these
they just
$100,
can't
please
be.
stand.
Muggers and robbers, no place seems
Yes,
to be
let's make
safe.
payroll.
You've
Carol.
been my protection every step of the way. Wanna say
Carol,
thank you,
flip this.
Lord, for all you've done for me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Could have been me outdoors with no food, no clothes, all alone without a friend, or just another number with a tragic end. But you didn't see fit to let none of these things be. Every day by your power.
Wait. We get happy and stop contributing. We're singing a minute. Wait. Stop everything. Stop every. I don't hear no noise. I don't want noise or money. You give $50 or more. Stand now. We need help. We're not operating on a Trump grant. Remember, we don't operate on a government grant. We need you to commit, invest in the proposition. Invest in what? Staff, travel, research. Brother Brian did not charge a